from across the university for helping to make this program work. Tonight we welcome Alexandra Horowitz, author of Inside of a Dog, What Dogs See, Smell, and Know, and her most recent book, just out in October, Being a Dog, Following the Dog into a World of Smell, among others. Inside of a Dog was on the New York Times bestseller list for more than 60 weeks, and if you've been fortunate enough to read it, you understand why. I haven't yet had a chance to read Being a Dog, but I read Inside of a Dog over the holiday break, and it actually has changed my relationship with my dog. One program note here, from 1 to 2:30 this Friday afternoon, Alexandra will be at Forest Park, 4501 Southwest 20th Avenue for what we're calling Gappy Hour. You are welcome to join us again, and even better, you're welcome to bring your dog with you to that event, as long as your dog is, reasonably well behaved and gets along well with other dogs. We don't want dog fighting going on. All right. In addition to her books, Dr. Horowitz has written for The New Yorker, for Smithsonian Magazine, and The New York Times, and she's also produced 2 TED videos. She teaches classes in animal behavior psychology and creative nonfiction writing at Barnard College, and also runs the Horowitz Canine Cognition Laboratory. Alexandra graduated with a bachelor's in philosophy from the University of Pennsylvania and earned a master's and a PhD in cognitive science from the University of California at San Diego. Her training, obviously, is in science, but anyone who reads her work will see that she also has mastered the craft of explaining complex scientific concepts through clear and engaging writing. Perhaps even more importantly, she understands, as successful journalists must, that we cannot be satisfied with forming conclusions about what others are doing or thinking based on what we know about ourselves. If we really want to understand ourselves or to understand others, and that includes dogs, we have to ask them about themselves. Now, I assume that most, if not all of you, are dog owners, or at least dog fans. If you are, then like me, I'm guessing that on more than one occasion, you've thought, man, I would love to know what my dog is thinking. Or, I'd love to know how my dog thinks about the world. Fortunately for us, Alexandra not only has wondered the same things, but she has done the careful, patient, ground level, and I do mean ground level, research to help answer those questions for all of us, giving us the chance to see the world from a dog's point of view. So please welcome Dr. Alexandra Horowitz.
That was very nice. Thank you, Kim. And thanks to the College of Journalism and Communications for having me here. It's a treat to be able to come and talk to you as a scientist and as a science writer. And that's a little bit what I'm going to do tonight. I want to tell you a little bit about this field of dog cognition that I am in and some of the studies that the field does and also that I have done. I'll walk you through a couple of those, and not only the kind of answers to the questions, but a little bit of the methods and how we do it. Because I think that's as intriguing in writing about science as just the fact of the results. And also talk to you a little bit about this latest project I did for Being a Dog, where I tried to understand more of the dog's smell universe, and you'll hear a little bit about that as we go. So I want to start with the question of who is the dog, because it feels like you know the answer to this. And this is one of the challenges and interests in studying dogs, is that the dog is so familiar, is so ubiquitous, is everywhere, maybe in your bed right now. We assume we already know everything about the dog, right? We even have a full vocabulary for talking about the dog. As soon as you get a dog, you start talking about what the dog knows and understands and feels and who they love more and the grudge they're holding against someone. And that's interesting, but also challenging as a scientist, because you basically have to unpack all of those things we think we know about dogs and try to build them up again empirically, and that's a lot of what I've done. Part of doing that is just knowing about the natural history of the dog. So briefly, it is interesting to imagine and think about who this creature is who is so present that actually we don't give them a lot of thought. The dog and the wolf, the gray wolf, share a common ancestor, some wolf-like creature, not identical to the wolf, from whom they both developed, probably 10 to 30,000 years ago, something like that. And it went from basically a pack animal who lived with their families to this domesticated, entirely responsive creature who lives with our families. The best story of how this domestication happened was that wolves kind of self-selected themselves. In other words, there was a time when humans started to settle into communities, and when we did that, we started to make something new, which was trash. We'd throw out our trash in big piles, and some wolves maybe had a little less fear than others and approached this as a new source of food and scavenged it. And the story goes that basically some of those wolves would have been taken in, kept into the village, maybe eaten once in a while, but maybe also the ones who were really cute, who looked really cute to us, raised for a bit. And then, fast forward a couple thousand years, we're suddenly selecting ourselves these dogs for the ones we like the most, that are most responsive to us, that look the cutest to us, have the biggest eyes, the biggest forehead. We start breeding them more. And thus we start creating breeds, specific breeds, although the specific breeds that we see today are really just the product of probably late 19th century creation of breeds. No breed is the most ancient breed. That's when it really started happening. We started showing different lines of dogs. One of the things we found most interesting, probably in our history, about dogs and kept them and bred them was that they do something that no other non-human animal really does, which is they look us in the eyes. No other animal does that reliably. And that's important for us because that's important for us. That's important in our communication. It leads to this feeling of shared understanding. And if you've had a dog gaze at you in the eyes, then it's hard to shake the feeling that you and the dog are onto something together. But that's not it. It also allows them to do something amazing, which is called social cognition in my field. And these were some of the first studies in the field, this type of study, that looked at how dogs used information from our face and from our gaze and from our pointing to find hidden food. Now, I'm going to tell you about a few studies. Almost all of them have one shared ingredient, which is hot dogs. If you want to get the dog to do a study for you, put a hot dog somewhere and see if they can find it. Is it a path? Is it hidden somewhere? Is it under a plate? Hot dogs is their motivation. So in this paradigm, the question that's asked of dogs is, can they solve a cognitive problem socially through using people? Well, it looks like they can. If you bait one of two buckets with a hot dog, and then you either stand behind it, body signals, stand and point, close or far. Even these kind of crazy ones where you're standing on the side and crossing over, or you're standing behind one and pointing at the other, they get where the hot dog is in every case. The only one they're not that great at is this cross-pointing one, which I think is sort of weird. If I'm standing between buckets, a point like that, they don't do very well. In other words, they do what even non-human primates don't do, which is that they understand that a point is about something distant in space. And that's because they started looking at us, following our gaze, and seeing our points as information. And this allows them to do also really amazing things that don't just have to do with our face, but the mind behind the face. They pay attention to our attention. And here again, hot dogs are involved in this paradigm. The researchers here are basically asking, how long does a dog steal food that is left out and that they're told not to eat? And there are a couple of different situations. One is, the person stays in the room but turns their back. So they're looking the other way. And the other one is they're sitting there with their eyes closed. And the other one is they're sitting there with their eyes open. And so basically they steal the food the fastest when your back is turned. I mean, you might be familiar with this phenomenon. And then the next fastest if you're sitting there with your eyes closed. And then they take a lot longer to steal the food if you're sitting there with your eyes open. But be assured the dogs still steal the food. But the important thing about this is that this is not something just about a stimulus, just about the eyes there or not. It's about the subtlety of the difference between sitting with eyes open and closed, the things that are important to us. It's about our attention. They're able to discriminate between levels of attention. So this is a whole line of research which goes into this, which is fabulous. There's also a lot of research about dogs' understanding of our language, and I think this is a fascinating line because Gary Larson is never far off with his animal behavior research at some level, because the only word we reliably use with most of our dogs is their name. That's going to be the thing they learn. Otherwise, we talk to them conversationally. We use different words with them. They're not language speakers. There's no particular reason that they would pick up on all of that. But there are dogs like this dog Chaser, who I'm not sure if you've ever heard of Chaser, but she famously, with her owner/trainer John Pilley, learned the names of 1,022 toys. These are some of the ones surrounding her. In fact, so many that John had to put the name of the toy on it, right? Because he couldn't remember what the names of the toys were. And she just learned that through very specific iterations by John of the word, showing the toy. Here's the word Einstein. This is Einstein. Go get Einstein. And then Chaser could learn to do different things with it, fetch or touch or nose or paw. So a little bit of a semantics there too, because he used these words reliably. You could talk about Chaser as a really smart dog, but I consider that Chaser is just an example of a dog who has a motivation to work and who somebody's talking to in a clear way. And the result is that actually they understand a good amount of language. But my interest in research began with, or one arm of my research I want to tell you about, this phenomenon of living with dogs that we all experience, which is that we look at a face like this and we have a very strong feeling about what that dog is feeling. In fact, it's hard to turn off that instinct that you know something about the subjective experience of that dog. And that's not just with this picture. We tend to anthropomorphize our dogs. We attribute to them human emotions, human experiences, and we assume that they like the things we like, that they feel sort of the way we feel. Sometimes I think this should be questioned. My feeling is like this is kind of an empirical question. So you could just anecdotally talk about things, behavior like this, dog kisses, where we think about this and in fact talk about it as a kiss, a sign of affection, right, that your dog may deliver to you. But you just have to take one step back and look at their common ancestors' behavior, the wolf, and you start to get a different picture of what that kiss might be. So, for instance, one of the things that happens in wolf packs is, as I said, these are family packs, and one or two wolves might go and hunt. As they return to the pack, what often happens is they get mobbed by other wolves in their family, licking around their faces. And this is a greeting, to be sure, but it also causes the wolves to do one thing, which is regurgitate a little bit of what they've eaten. And that's what they do, and all the pups and the other wolves around eat some of that food. So that licking in your face is a greeting. You can call it a kiss. But another way to describe it is a request for some of that sandwich that you had when you were out. This is another type of thing that we do. Another phenomenon of anthropomorphizing that we do is we put our dogs in coats and we assume it's raining. I want to wear a coat. So does my dog. My dog doesn't want to be wet. Well, I think it's worth considering. What might that feel like for a dog? And here again, you might look at wolf behavior. Sometimes wolf behavior is educational in this regard. And there is a behavior among wolves which is called a standover. When one wolf is being more dominant or scolding another wolf, they stand closely over them, pressing on their back. And I think it's an open question whether when you put on a tight coat, I don't know if any of you do that with your dogs, and they kind of freeze in place, their vestigial experience is of somebody more dominant around, forcing them to stay there. Sure, they're cooperative, they'll go out with the jacket. In fact, they might even start liking it because guess what? It always leads to a walk. But the question of whether they need the jacket, I think, should be answered by looking at natural behavior. So personally, I got interested in this type of anthropomorphism. These I grabbed off of Flickr. These were tagged as sad dogs. And these guys as proud dogs. And I think, well, maybe you're proud, or maybe you just have to hold your head up really high if you're a small dog with a really big stick. Or happy. Or is it, it's hard not to feel that about this, right? Or is it just that the edges of their mouth naturally turn up in a curvature, like the dolphin mouth, for instance. So I got very interested in some of the emotions that we assume that dogs have, and thought, hey, I can bring some science to this. And so I started with this one, guilt. And I got interested, and I love this cartoon because it's all sorts of attributions happening. You know, it's like looking and seeing themselves and feeling bad about what you're doing, but not really feeling bad. So, and all of those things it's empirical questions in my mind. I got interested because of phenomena like this. There was, in 2006, a Doberman named Barney who was perhaps unwisely put in charge of an invaluable teddy bear collection overnight as a guard dog. When they arrived in the morning, this was the scene they saw. The report said heads pulled off, arms, legs here and there. It was a total carnage. There was stuffing, fluff, and bear bits everywhere. He methodically, ruthlessly had disemboweled all of these teddy bears, including Elvis's teddy bear Mabel. But some people said, he looks sorry. You know, is he sorry? He has this guilty look. It has components. We can name those components: downcast ears, averted gaze. And so as a researcher of behavior, I looked for those clues of his outward appearance that were leading people to make some assumptions about what he's experiencing. And I did a study to tease apart elements of the guilty look, to see what its parts are and when we see it. To see if, and in fact, you know, Darwin suggested that dogs feel shame. So this is a long history to see if, in fact, we're right in that assumption. So what I did was I set up a simple experiment where I went to owners' homes. I like to experiment on dogs in natural settings, and the natural setting for the dog is around us, you know, with us. I went to owners' homes and I asked them to put a hot dog in front of their dogs and tell them not to eat it. And they and the owner left the room. And so the dog was sitting there with the hot dog, and one of two things happened. He was obedient, refrained from eating the treat, or ate the treat, right? One of those two things was happening. And then I called the owners back in the room, and I asked them to, if the dog had been obedient, I asked them to greet the dog happily, like they would, coming back from the other room. Hello, it's nice to see you. But if they were disobedient, I asked them to scold their dog. And they did that however they naturally did that, which was usually giving a severe, no, did you eat that? This type of thing. So sometimes the right thing happened. The dog was obedient, was greeted by the owner. The dog was disobedient or was scolded. But sometimes I deceived the owner as to what had happened in their absence. So the dog was disobedient, had eaten the treat. But I said to the owner, oh, they didn't eat it. And so the dog was greeted when the owner returned to the room. And sometimes the dog, this is the sad one, was obedient, had not eaten the treat, but when the owner came back in the room, I said, he ate it. And so they were scolded. And then I videotaped what was happening. I videotaped the dog's behavior in that case, and I wanted to code to see how much guilty look they showed in each one of these conditions. And so the types of guilty behaviors I were looking for were things like rolling over, ears down, and averting gaze. There was also shaking the paw. Lifting a paw is one of the behaviors people said is part of the guilty look. Dropping their tail, a low wag between the legs, their head down, and licking the air, sort of air licking. So I'm going to show you a little reenactment of that critical condition where the dog is obedient, but is punished.
Leave it, leave it, leave it, leave it, leave it.
Come back in, she ate it.
What did you do?
It is such a good guilty looker. So what I found is that, in fact, guilt didn't change the rate of the guilty look. So if we look just at the cases where the dogs had eaten or not eaten the treat, actually saw the same amount of guilty look in both cases. But owner behavior did change the rate of guilty look. So they showed a huge amount of the guilty look, significantly more when they were scolded than when they were greeted. And again, most sort of the poignant example, dogs looked the most guilty when they were not guilty, but they were punished as though they were. So this is a kind of puzzle, right? Dogs looked more guilty when they were scolded, not when they were actually guilty. That guilty look doesn't seem to map to a feeling in the dog's head that they've done something wrong and they feel sorry about it. So what does it map to? Well, instead, this look is likely an appeasement behavior, which is designed to avoid punishment. It's a submissive behavior that they learn over interaction with us. No matter how you deal with dog, puppies don't have this look. They learn it by responding to our cues. And even before you scold them, you start putting on the bearing of an angry person, and they've learned, put on that cute face. And sometimes they can avoid punishment in that way. So this isn't to say that dogs don't feel guilt. I'm agnostic as to that point. They might feel guilt, but this guilty look, the thing that causes us to assign that to their heads, isn't a manifestation of it. Oh, and incidentally, when I divided these groups into different classes, dogs who had been in obedience classes and dogs who hadn't, the dogs who'd been in obedience classes showed more guilty look in every situation. So they really learn this in a kind of teaching setting than the dogs who'd never been in obedience classes. So the next attribution that I looked at, and it's the most common attribution of dogs by their owners, is that of jealousy. From what people say about jealousy when they see it, it's most commonly a situation where the people think the dog feels like there's an unfairness. So in fact, what I tested is whether the dogs had a sense of a fairness of a situation. So for instance, people will say, when I'm giving attention to one dog, my dog gets so jealous and comes in to get that attention themselves. Or I'm feeding treats to two dogs and I need to feed the same number of treats to both dogs or my dog gets jealous. So I thought, well, again, we can test this attribution and see if it holds up. So I'm testing whether they had a sense of fairness by basically putting them in a social situation with another dog, where so two dogs, the subject and the control, approach two types of people. One who's a fair person, I call them a fair trainer, and one who's an unfair person. And I'm going to see who they prefer after they're exposed to these types of people. Humans actually prefers fairness. In various ways, we try to change our behavior to create a fair situation. Well, dogs. Well, so this is what the fair trainer looked like. What would happen is that a dog, and in this case the control is my dog, Finnegan, the subject is the little beagle, would approach these trainers in turn, and each trainer would ask them to sit, a very easy task, and would give them a treat for sitting. So for doing this amazing task of sitting, they get a hot dog. The fair trainer gives the same treat to each dog. There's also an unfair trainer. The unfair trainer gives the same amount to the subject, but always gives a different amount to the control. So dog trainers could be unfair in two ways. They could give more to the other dog, which is what this trainer did, or what I don't have a picture of is also they could give less. So in some cases, the subject got one piece of hot dog and the other dog got nothing. And they see this, the trainers put their hands back and forth, so they see, and they very carefully watch what the other dog is getting. So here the control dog is getting 3 times as much. So here are our situations. The trainers could be fair. They're giving each one bit of hot dog, or unfair, giving less to the subject and more to the control dog, or unfair, giving more to the subject and less to the control dog. Importantly, in each case, the subject gets the same. So if they didn't care about fairness one way or another, they would distinguish between them. If they care about fairness, though, they would avoid the unfair situations in every case. But here's what we saw. When you put the fair versus the unfair trainer who gave less to the other guy, maybe not surprisingly, they chose randomly between those people. They didn't care if there was an unfairness to the other dog that they were with, right? And maybe that's not surprising. When you're feeding your dogs, they never speak up and they're like, have you fed the cat? You know, like this is time also to feed the cat. You know, they seem to be oblivious to what's happening to the other, or at least they're not making their choice based on the fairness or unfairness perceived fairness or unfairness of that situation. But interestingly, when selecting between the fair trainer and an unfair trainer who had given them less, they chose the unfair trainer. They reliably go to the unfair trainer who's always giving them less. Each time they come, the other dog gets 3, I get 1, every single time. And when they're given a choice, they choose that person. So I thought this shows, potentially, this was sort of a surprising result to us, but given that they prefer to associate with a trainer who treated them unfairly, there's some other component of that trainer which became salient, important to them. She had more food. She had 3 times as much food as all the other trainers in every circumstance. Even though it never went to them, that's the salient thing that they noticed. They're looking at where the resources are. That's a concern with fairness of the situation, than a concern for who has all the food, and go to them. If anything, I would call them less potentially jealous in the way we're thinking about it, and more optimists, right? That they're always thinking, I'll try again, I'll try again, I'll try again. Maybe this time I get more food. So this type of my research is part of developing the idea that we should take a different tactic, or at least rethink the way we talk about and look at our dogs. In some cases, we'll be right in our attributions, and in other cases, maybe we're a little bit off. But recently, I've gotten much more interested in looking at the dog from their own terms, and that has to do with this: imagining what it's like to be a dog. And for a dog, the world doesn't appear the way we see it. You know, for dog, the nose beats eyes. All of those studies that I talked about, those social cognitive studies, are about visual understanding. How do you see this visual world we're in? But dogs are not in a visual world. They're in a world of olfaction. You know, if there were, the dogs in this room right now are not perceiving this room in the same way as we are perceiving this room. We all know that dogs' noses are good, but it's actually only been recently that we've discovered just how good they are. As we open our eyes and see the world in front of us, dogs come out of sleep with their nostrils working, basically. And there are a couple of good anatomical and behavioral reasons why. One is they have a lot more tissue devoted to smell than we do. So humans have about 5 million olfactory cells. These are receptor cells, the things that grab the odors out of the air. Right at the back of our nose, this is just like a nice warming, humidifying tunnel for the odors to race up. We have 5 million cells back there, that's pretty good, except the dogs have 200 million to 1 billion cells based on the breed. And they have what I like to talk about as 2 noses in a way. So there's this familiar nose that we all know, that and I very much love. That muzzle is very important, that houses many bones that have tissue on them. And even the wetness of their nose is designed to snag odor molecules out of the air. Some need to be absorbed to be smelled. By the way, their nostrils work also amazingly well. They get a different odor picture. They work independently, so they get a different odor picture from each nostril and create a kind of stereo olfactory scene of the world. So they have that first nose, but they also have another kind of nose above the roof of their mouth, under the nasal septum, the thing that divides the nose. They have something called a vomeronasal organ, which, in fact, many mammals have. We no longer have a vomeronasal organ. We develop it in utero, and then it doesn't develop any further, and there are no connections to it. But what it allows is an animal to detect hormones, things that don't have a smell. And they're not odors that are in the air. Instead, things that have to be absorbed, say, in that wet nose, and smelled. This is how they can detect pheromones. This is how they can detect hormones. So detecting hormones, it is true at some level that they smell fear, and potentially sadness and delight. Things that we experience that are accompanied by a kind of exhale of hormones from us are detectable with the vomeronasal organ. Unlike us, if you look inside their nose, they have a separate path for inhaling to breathe, for respiring, and for sniffing. So they have a dedicated pathway to sniffing, which is entirely different than our sniff. And they sniff better than we do too. I didn't even know before I looked into this research that there was a better or worse way to sniff, But our way is a really clumsy method. When you want to sniff, you sniff in, and when you want to exhale, you exhale out, right? In fact, if you want to get an odor out of your nose, you exhale it out. But dogs, interestingly, don't want to get an odor out of their nose. They want to keep sniffing the world. So they create what experts call charmingly expired turbulent canine nostril air jets. Through high-speed videography, what these researchers of airflow have seen is that when they exhale through the side slits of their nose. And what this does is creates a little puff of air that in fact can stir more odor molecules off of a surface. If you've ever seen a little puff coming off of the ground where a dog is sniffing, that's from the exhale. It stirs more odor up to be inhaled. They do a kind of circular breathing and hurry the next kind of snout full of odors up to the olfactory receptor cells. This enables them to do amazing feats. So for instance, a tracking dog, if we were faced with this scene of which way did this person go, this is not a difficult visual problem. But we have a lot more difficulty with it if suddenly the track is compromised in some way, if the water has washed over, it's deteriorated in some way. But research has shown that tracking dogs are able to tell which way somebody went by smelling the difference in odor concentration from the first to the fifth footstep. So the newer footstep will have the most odor in it. Over 2 seconds, the odor of the first footstep has deteriorated a small amount, enough so that the dog can tell the difference. And in this way is able to sense the directionality of the way the person has gone. So that is the sensitivity that results from those hundreds of millions of cells from a different way of sniffing, from the elaborate snout. I think that dogs are, if you start thinking about it this way, essentially smelling time. Because weaker odors are older and stronger odors are newer. So when they go outside your house in the morning and they're smelling the ground, they're smelling who has passed by before you got there, in the past, overnight. And as you walk down a street and they smell something on the breeze, they're smelling someone coming around the corner who you will meet in a minute, coming around the corner. So I feel like smell kind of rubber bands the present moment for dogs. When I started thinking about it this way, in the second arm of my research, I started doing experiments which entirely change what the modality is. In other words, instead of doing visual experiments, I started doing experiments to try to understand what the dog's olfactory world is like. What is it like? What do they know with olfaction? And for instance, one of the types of questions cognitive scientists ask of non-human animals is, do they have a sense of self? Do they recognize themselves as we look in a mirror and we recognize ourselves? And if we have spinach between our teeth, we go to pick it out once we see it in the mirror. Do they have that sense of, that's myself, and I can correct my vision of myself in the mirror? Dogs, when they're faced with this challenging test, don't seem to care. If you put something on their face and they're faced in the mirror with their own image, they do not move to remove it from their face, right? They don't pass what's called the mirror self-recognition test, which some other animals do pass. But we know they can see a mirror, right? They can use a mirror to see that something's coming up behind them. Often they'll be interested in something happening in the mirror. They're visually able to see it. So I thought the problem with this test, which we're asking of humans and non-humans, is it doesn't smell. It doesn't smell like anything. And that's the way the dog is perceiving the world. So that's the punchline. If we looked at how dogs actually behave based on their others' behavior, we would say dogs are interested in how everybody around them smells. So what if we created an olfactory mirror, essentially, and ask, do dogs use smells to recognize themselves as they do to recognize others? You all know, if you live with a dog, that they're constantly smelling down this length of your street for the evidence of dogs who've passed by before. But they don't seem to smell their own leavings that much. If they urinate somewhere, they don't come back later to sort of see what's happened. So maybe they're discriminating between themselves and others by their smell. So I created a study. I didn't create, I'm almost happy to say, and I think it's just a relief, a smelly mirror. I don't have that. But I used the substance that they're using to find out about each other, which is a little bit of their urine. So we asked owners to collect urine from their own dogs, which I'm so happy to say your owners were willing to do for us. Bring it in. And we basically put a very small amount, because through trial and error I learned you don't need to put a lot of urine, a little canister for a dog to know that it's there, in these canisters, and then presented the dogs with a small amount of their own odor as well as the odor of another dog. And also we contrasted their own odor with their own odor change. So we added something else, an uninteresting smell to their urine. And we said, all right, if they're just presented with these odors, which one will they choose? This was a kind of sniffing test, basically. I was looking at how long they sniff. And just so you can see a little bit of how this science works, I'm going to show you a short video of some of our subjects. She's just drawing their interest. This gets a little bit long, but Rebecca's very loud. He's our outlier. No, give us that way. So that's what it's like to be a dog behavior researcher. You always have a lot of them on hand. So really what we're looking at is there's data there of how long they spent sniffing each of these canisters. So for instance, when they were faced with their own odor, so this is entirely out of context. They're encountering this odor. Do they recognize it as themselves, in which case it's probably not that interesting? And the odor of another dog, do they spend more time there? They do sniff themselves. They spend a lot more time investigating the odor of the other dog. So that's nice. That meant that we reproduced what they naturally do in the field, in the environment, their normal environments, in the lab. That was good. Then this is the one we were more interested in, when they have themselves again, but changed. Their own smells changed. They've looked in the mirror and there's spinach between their teeth. They spend a lot longer investigating that one that has their changed smell. So I think what this seems to show is that they're recognizing that odor as themselves. Some beginning of, if not fully, I can be agnostic about that, a sense of self. So just quickly, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I further did. This is my dog Finnegan and his lovely nostrils, to try to imaginatively put myself into the world, the head of the dog, what it might be like to be a dog. I thought, gee, if I want to know what the olfactory world is like, experiments are one way, but I should do some experiential journalism here, follow the dog. The dog is sniffing these things on our walks. I too should sniff these things on our walks. So I went out with my dogs We started strong, and I followed them out, and they started sniffing a little tree guard, this iron fence around trees in New York City. And then they finished up, and they started walking down the street, but I stopped them, and I held the dogs and my leashes in one hand, and I kneeled down and sniffed it myself. And there was a strong smell. I don't know what it was. It was sort of a paint-like smell. I smelled it a little more. It was kind of a relief that it wasn't the smell I anticipated that it would be. And as I look up, my dogs are standing looking at me, giving me a look. And there's a couple coming up the street, steps off the sidewalk and walks into the street and walk around me. It was socially awkward, which is what it's like to be a smeller in this world. So I realized I needed the help of some professionals to try to understand what smelling might be like. So I met this woman named Kate McLean, who is pictured here, who does smell walking expeditions. She's a sensory artist interested in mapping what each block of a city smells like. And in fact, every block, square city block, has characteristic smells. So she leads groups of people around, and we all start very embarrassed about smelling anything. Then somebody kind of goes off toward a trash can and sticks their nose over it and discovers something. And then suddenly everybody is nosing the trees and the air conditioner units and anything that looks new in a scene. And when someone walks by, we all lift our nose in the air and starting to learn to use our noses essentially the way the dogs use their noses. And I also went to people who work with odors professionally. I went and did a scent study at a woman named Leslie Vosshall's research lab at Rockefeller University, where I had to smell hundreds of bottles of little odors and try to describe them and put words to them. I studied with perfumers and learned the components of complex perfumes and how to identify them. And I studied with sommeliers who identify the odor notes that come off of a wine before and after you taste the wine. I went animal tracking with some naturalists who track animals in the wild, not just by looking for visual tracks, but also through smelling. And on the snowy day, anything that had been present recently had a strong smell. Snow is actually pretty good for smelling. This is Charlie Eisman smelling where a hawk had eaten its last meal. And I was so proud that right here I smelled a porcupine. And in fact, porcupines have a very piney smell, so their urine smells very piney. And in fact, based on that, we then followed the tracks and found the porcupine. His den was nearby. And so that feels like a new superpower that actually our noses, remember, 5 million cells, not so bad. If we started to use, we could imagine ourselves a little bit more into the world of the dog. I just recently put together a TED Ed it was published earlier this week that I encourage you to go look up, giving us some strategies. I won't play it now, about how we can learn to use our sense of smell. And in my mind, to appreciate the dog's perspective a little bit more. And I'll just wrap up by talking about, because I like to bring it back to what it's like to live with a dog and how the science can be useful. So I think that imagining the dog's point of view, we can look again at things that happen that sometimes we talk about as misbehavior. And instead of talking about it as a misbehavior, we try to imagine and the problem that it is for us. My dog ate my shoes. What's the problem for the dog that caused this to happen, right? So your dog might eat your shoes or your socks or your underwear or whatever it is when you're away. That seems like the dog, and look guilty when you return, but of course, as we now know, the dog reacts to us. The guilty look is probably just becoming familiar with the fact that we get angry when something's happened during the day, and they don't necessarily know what. And the reason they've done this is because they haven't been given enough to do, and you've left them alone too long. And they, by the way, your things smell of you. You know, even if you can't smell, notice the smell of them. Everything you wear, where's your odor? And so guess what? They seek out those things that smell of you and spend time with them. So suddenly this behavior looks more like something which should prompt us to change our behavior vis-a-vis the dog, rather than assume the dog's going to understand that we don't like when they chew up our shoes. Similarly with jumping up behavior, people don't like that. But imagine it again from the dog's point of view. Dogs are knee height, or maybe ankle height, you know, and our mouths are way up here. And they smell so good. They smell so good. And so they're trying to get to that smell source, to get information from us You can solve this problem brilliantly by giving them something to smell, getting down to their level, offering them, if you don't want them to smell your mouth, your ear to smell. I like to give dogs my ear, and they love to smell it. And suddenly this misbehavior is turned on its head. Or a dog that won't heel, for instance, on your left side, which many people still like to have their dogs heeling carefully. Well, there are a lot of explanations for that. One has to do, of course, now you're going to know the punchline to this, with smell. You know, for dog, what is happening on a walk is not that you're getting exercise, or you're making it around the block, or you're even going out to relieve the dog's bladder. That's their olfactory fireworks moment. And there's a really good smell over there, not on your left side. And if the walk can be once in a while reconstructed to indulge what it's like for the dog, you won't have that problem. Also, dogs have a kind of handedness, what you might call a pawedness, where they work better with one side than the other. So if a dog is kind of right-pawed, maybe they like to have their right on the outside and their left next to you. So maybe they prefer to be on the other side. Behaviors like this, some people consider impolite, but now we can really just describe it as a chemical communication between two dogs of their identity, of their sex, of what they've recently eaten, even of their gender, right? Dogs don't look underneath each dog to see if it's male or female. They smell it. You smell male or female. And I started to look again at some behaviors like this. Of course, when they're shaken, they're getting rid of water. That's just a desire to free the body of water. But guess what else it is? It's a spraying of your odor in the environment. Similar with this. This is my dog's lovely slow motion tail greeting of me when I come home. This is a greeting. It is a sign of happiness. But what is it also? It's a way to spread all that olfactory information from the tail and anal glands that tells dogs who the dog is. When dogs meet each other, they do a lot of that behavior. That's a way to get the olfactory information of their identity out there. So what I ask basically is that we start attending to the dog the way they're attending to us, the way they're watching us, learning our habits. I want us to re-look at the dog. All right, I'll end it there with thanks to my lab, because my lab members are who makes it work, and occasionally one of these companies gives me food or toys to bring in people, and that's wonderful as well. And with thanks to the college for having me today. Thanks. And I'm happy to take some questions as well. Yes?
When you were talking about dogs feeling guilty with the treat shaming exercise, you concluded that the dogs react the way they do because the humans have sort of conditioned them to do that. But does that mean that the reaction isn't genuine? Because humans also react in guilty ways when they're scolded, so...
Right, is it not genuine? So the question is, in that case where the dogs look like they're reacting to the owner's behavior instead of to their own internal feelings of understanding the rightness and wrongness and having violated them, does that mean it's not a real true reaction? No, absolutely. One could make the case. I think you're right, it is a true reaction. It's just that it's not necessarily emanating just from them. It's emanating from somebody else. Somebody else is prompting it. One could argue that human guilt arises from a social understanding, right? And it's more complicated understanding than maybe the dog has. We have an understanding of behavior in groups and what's permissible in different contexts. And how do we show our guilt? We probably don't show it at all, actually. We might not. It might not even be visible. But it's probably also at some level a learned behavior, just based on maybe a more cognitive, sophisticated capacity, potentially.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question. Yes?
In your discussion about jealousy,
Mm-hmm.
I may have missed something, but was there a conclusion on why dogs get jealous?
Well,
Because of course, as a dog owner, we've all experienced
yeah.
that direct impact of growling and wanting to get the other dog away. So I'm not sure I understood your conclusions on the jealousy.
Right, so what's the conclusion from that jealousy experiment? Essentially, it's that what looks like the experience of jealousy to us can be better explained as interest in resources. So that could be in the case where a dog is growling when another dog gets close to their food, they're guarding their resource.
That I understand.
Right, but also when somebody has a lot of food that they're giving out to dogs, and your dog seems to be jealous, we don't know. And we have to say, I don't know what the dog's internal, subjective experience is. It doesn't seem to be based on whether there's a fair or unfair situation like our jealousy does. Instead, it seems to be based on wanting to be near the place where there's a lot of resource. So that's a better explanation for that behavior that owners describe to me. Oh, whenever I'm giving attention to another dog, my dog gets jealous. I would say, well, your dog sees that there's a lot of attention being given out, and that's what your dog is doing.
Got it.
Yeah.
I know what you mean. So therefore, I'm the resource of all the goodies.
Yes.
So therefore,
They're trying to get to you. Yes, because you create, you have all the resources. And attention is a resource, right? Praise and attention is also something that they want more of. Yeah.
Also, I run canine agility with my springers.
Great.
And I had an issue where one of my springers was shut down, go into a tunnel, and refused to come out. And I even went so far as to speaking to a dog communicator. I was really trying to figure out what I was doing wrong. Came to conclusion our energies clashed. He was earth and I was fire, and we clashed. My question to you in your experiments, have you found like energies between a human and a dog can clash, or they pick up on energies?
Right, so the question is if this description of what's happening when dog and a person aren't working together well as different energies, if that's something that comes up in my research. It's not a scientific, in the literal sense of the way of describing what's happening. I mean, I'd say that what a communicator might talk about as energies science would probably try to re-describe that as something else. In other words, as a different level, different thresholds of fear or responsiveness or different attention levels or, of each one of the other. So we would re-describe it and it wouldn't talk about it in terms of energies. It's not a language which is profitable to sort of experiment with. But if it works for you and getting your dog to work with you cooperatively, then great.
I just had to get into his energy.
Right. Well, in my idea is you get into what their perspective is, and that's something that we can approach from that direction.
So in your experiment, you've never really seen any kind of clashes of energies between dogs and people?
It's just not a kind of...
it's not scientific enough? Or?
It's not energy is not really describable in scientific terminology, right? It's intentionally kind of outside of science, as a matter of fact. So no, I mean, one could try to deconstruct it, which is the kind of thing I do like to do, but I haven't, no, it wouldn't be the way that to me, that's not an explanation. That's something that needs further explication, as a matter of fact.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yes?
I have actually two questions.
Sure.
One, you briefly mentioned when the wolf was kind of being over the other one being on the back. The dominant one is the one standing over, correct? Can that be displayed in play? Because she, with other dogs, when she plays with them, she loves to stand right on top of them. Especially my Aussie, she'll stay right above him and loves to get him on his back.
Yeah.
But he kind of does the same thing. They kind of do equally. Are they both trying to establish dominance, or are they both actually playing? Right.
So the question is about that standover behavior, whether that's something, when it shows up in play, what does that mean in play? Is it a dominance display or something else? Well, play is wonderful, and I started studying dogs through play, going out, which sounds so difficult for my dissertation. I went out to the parks and beaches and videotape play, and then I would watch the videos 30th of a second at a time and see what was happening at each 30th of a second, which is a good way to make watching play not so exciting, and by the way. And the interesting thing about play is that it's using behaviors from life. So they're using behaviors, sexual behaviors, aggressive behaviors, food behaviors, any other behaviors from other contexts are then put into this context. And if you frame the interaction with a play signal, like we all know the classic one, you go the play bow, you go down on your forelimbs and you stick your rump in the air and you wave your tail. Except for the tail, you can do this with your dog. It's like a play signal, like, I want to play. It seems to be asking something like, I want to play. If you do that, then you can suddenly do all those behaviors in this play context, and they don't have their normal meaning. They're just playful. The way that if we decide, like you and I decide, like, let's play boxer, and I walk up to you and hit you in the face, it's kind of okay, right? But if I don't say that, and I just walk up and hit you in the face, and it's a punch in the face. So that behavior is probably not a scolding behavior. It's just one of the things you take on in normal social interactions that in play, they take on as sort of a role. And as you point out, boy, sometimes they seem to switch back and forth from being on their back to being over. That's really nice balanced play, where the dogs switch roles. When one dog just starts being one role all the time, sometimes play falls apart. The other dog doesn't want to play anymore. But usually they switch roles back and forth. But using bites, aggressive things, mounting, right? All that stuff, that's not sexual. It's like, I've got this behavior, and I'm going to stick it into play. So yeah, it doesn't mean anything except for a part of play.
Okay.
And then you had another second question.
Yeah. So I've been having issues with my dog getting in the trash and everything, and
Yeah.
I'll come home and
One of those slides was your dog.
Yeah. Yes. And he is going to be 8 this year. Never in his entire life has he ever done that. I've never been concerned about leaving anything out. And just in the past month, he just started getting into the trash.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure where it derived from. And so I think it was because I would casually throw food in there, and I think at one point he was watching me do that, and he's like, that's a source of food.
Mm-hmm.
So he started knocking it over.
Mhm.
So I started placing a cage over it, but he could tell every time I came home and there was trash around, I was frustrated. And then when I come home, there's no trash on the floor. I come home and I'm happy. And he never kind of associates that together. So
Right,
and
right. Because it might have happened a long time ago that he knocked over the trash can. Got it,
And I would even sit him down and you're gonna watch me put this stuff away. It's how would you stop that type of behavior?
Yeah, well, I would say, so this is, if your dog starts doing knocking over the trash and they hadn't before, how can you stop that? Well, in this case, I would definitely stop doing that ritual of showing your dog that you put in. Your dog is not connecting that to what they did earlier, except for through your being angry in both contexts. But then mostly what's happening is they're learning that you have a new side, the angry side. You sometimes show up angry. And it's exciting. Maybe they know it has something to do with this other thing that happened some other time, hours before, which was also exciting for them, which was that they found something in the trash. But they're not making that causal connection. We assume they know the rules of our house because they live well in our house, but they simply don't, your dog just discovered that you have gotten sufficiently cavalier that you think you can leave the trash out, and probably you could for a while until your dog discovered it. And then suddenly they discovered and they're going to be on it again and again and again. And I have to say the first behavior you can do is just, you just literally put it away, put it behind a cabinet and they're not going to get into it, and that actually solves the issue. It doesn't correct the dog. And what people seem to want to do is say, yeah, but I want the dog to get it. I want the dog to know it's wrong. I don't think that's the way the dog's mind works. The dog does not have a moral code about human behavior. No, but it's really an important point to realize. We think if they live in our house, they know the rules of our house. But those are opaque. Imagine being a child who's born into they have to learn. I explicitly teach my son every little rule about behavior with other people. Right? And every rule is being taught through telling. And the dog just is totally another species, comes in, is put in this setting and expected to kind of understand. They're doing the best they can with us here, right? But I think we have to create the situation so they don't have the problem. It's attractive, that trash can, so just put it away. Yeah.
Time for one more question.
What kind of memory do dogs have? Do they have much long or short-term memory?
Yeah. So the question is about memory of dogs, and there hasn't been as much research on that as I wish that there had, and partly because it's intractable, it's hard to get to. In other words, how do you test what the dog's memory is? Well, you could do something like hide something, they go away for 3 months, do they remember where it was? They can, sure. If you haven't seen your dog for 8 months, they're going to recognize you in return. They're remembering that, right? There's some good recent evidence that they have episodic memory, This is still being debated, which is essentially a memory for an episode, kind of what we think of as an important autobiographical memory, where I remember, if I say to you, like, do you remember last time you went to your grandma's house? You're all now like going to that moment at your grandmother's house, the episode that you had, and thinking about it. And there's some evidence that dogs might have some of that as well. But we don't know the nature of it. It doesn't exist in language, actually, so we don't know really what it's like. But their memories seem to be perfectly good, as anyone who's tried to hide something a long time ago from their dog knows. The science just hasn't reached us yet.
But they don't connect, like if she yells at the dog for something it did 3 hours ago. They remember that they did
what they remember,
not connect.
Right, why would they connect that? It has nothing to do with 3 hours ago. What it has to do with is her. They see her, she comes in, and she's yelling. They remember that. That's what they remember. Okay, well, thank you all very much.
Thank you all for coming out, and if you have time on Friday,